politics and current affairs programmes for the BBC, including Panorama and other current affairs programmes, but I was mainly in charge of political programmes. The political programme on television that I ran was called On the Record, and we did 2 April Fool's films whilst I was in charge of it when April the 1st fell on Sunday, which is when we were broadcast. The first one of which was stated that the Houses of Parliament in London were going to sink into the mud because of the impact of global warming, and that and we had a huge number of people, very prestigious people lined up to substantiate the story that the House of Parliament were going to be moved out of London and moved to Manchester instead. I have to say, unfortunately, that's come true. and discussions are currently in play about where we're going to situate the Houses of Parliament temporarily whilst it's rescued from the waters of the Thames, which it's gradually sinking into, and its structure is refurbished to make it last for another few hundred years. That discussion is currently taking place. The second April Fool's film that I did was about how the government was going to encourage people to vote in the UK through a series of increasingly absurd measures that they were going to take. One of which was to give a ticket for the UK's national lottery to everybody who turned out to vote in an election. And 2 years later, a very senior politician by the name of David Blunkett proposed that people should be given a national lottery ticket every time they turned up to vote. So I'm afraid I've stopped doing April Fool's films because unfortunately all the ones that I did were gradually coming true. I'm going to talk about the challenges and pressures facing public service media, and I wanted to talk about the dilemmas that a public service media has, or any media corporation has, in making sure that it retains its editorial standards when putting advertising on its services and its commercial services, which the BBC has in its overseas branch, which is called BBC Worldwide. In the UK, the BBC's public service television, radio and online services are funded by the licence fee. A licence fee is essentially a tax on every household in the UK, levied at £145.50 per annum. So you can quickly work out what that is in your own currency. And all of the BBC services in the UK, and that consists of 7 national television channels, about 9 national radio channels, 40-something local radio channels, its BBC, its news online service and other online services, its TV catch-up service, which is known as iPlayer, and so on and so forth. All of those are available for £145.50 a year. So they don't carry any advertising, they don't carry any sponsorship, and the only commercial income that the BBC receives is from its commercial arm, which operates a little bit in the UK, selling things like DVDs of programmes and so on and so forth, but also operates in worldwide. So many of you who have experienced the BBC through our worldwide channels and our World News Service, which does, as you know, carry advertising. Now, I thought I might say a little bit about the financial situation of the BBC at the moment, because it resonates with a lot of my public service broadcasting colleagues around the world, because the BBC, like many public service, like much public service media, is under attack. It's under attack partly for the reasons that Tommy was referring to, the combination of an ideological opposition by politicians in some parts of the media, a running up against the commercial interests of newspapers in particular in the online space, and Stephen in particular in The Guardian, which offers a free website, will understand that newspaper proprietors in the UK are particularly upset that the BBC offers a free online news service in the UK, which competes directly with newspaper websites. I mean, it does, you have to admit that it does, and therefore may cost them revenue. So in those two areas we come into competition with people, as well as the ideological opposition of some parts of the industry, and all of that together with the the situation, the economic situation, which has offered an opportunity for governments to argue that public service media should suffer the same fate as government expenditure has suffered in the post-financial crash recession, and namely have their budgets cut at the same time. So the BBC, that's all flowed through, and I know it has in ABC in Australia and CBC in Canada and DR in Denmark, and a lot of my public service colleagues are in the same position, that up to 2017-18 financial year, i.e. next financial year, the BBC licence fee would have been frozen, would have been flat for 7 years. So there's been no increase in the licence fee for 7 years. At the same time, in the last licence fee settlement, which took place in 2010, the government insisted that the BBC absorbed the cost of providing World Service radio across the world, which is an outstanding service which is mainly directed at countries in the world, and most of you don't come from them, but some of you do, which don't have a particularly vibrant local media which holds its politicians and others to account. But we had to absorb that. That was about £250 million. We had to absorb the cost of some of the broadband rollout in the UK, about £300 million, and we were required to donate £25 million to a commercial local news initiative that was happening in the UK. So all of that money, as well as having a flat licence fee over that period, all of that money was taken out of the BBC budget for use on other projects, or we had to absorb the cost of providing a service, the World Service, which was previously paid for directly by our Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So that was in the period up to 2017-18. We've just had a licence fee settlement. I describe it as a settlement. It was more of an imposition, actually, by the government for the next 5 years. And in that period, we're going to be required to absorb the cost of providing free licence fees for the over 75s in the UK, which, as they are in most of our societies, are a growing number. The current cost of that provision is about £650 million. So we're going to be required in the next licence fee period to find £650 million. We will stop paying the broadband cost that I just described of rolling out broadband and the local news cost, and we will have a licence fee that will increase with what is called, with one of the measures of retail prices in the UK, which is called Consumer Price Index, CPI. But the total effect of all of that is the Director General said in a recent speech that we're probably going to find ourselves £800 million of what you might call savings, cuts, efficiency savings, however you like to describe them, over the next 5-year period. And I can tell you that having found a not dissimilar figure in the last 7 years, we are not going to be able to do that without substantially cutting our services. It's just a fact of life. We have taken out all of the costs that we possibly can. There's always a bit more that you can do, but fundamentally we're going to have to cut services that the BBC provides, which won't be popular with our viewers and listeners. I was telling a colleague just now about a study that we've done, which you might be interested in the BBC over the recent times, which we call our deprivation study. And what we do is we go to people, we went to a number of households who said that they objected to paying the licence fee for the BBC. Either they thought it was not value for money, or they just thought it was wrong. For some other reason, they just said they didn't use BBC services, so why should they pay for them, and so on and so forth. And we said, okay, will you agree to us switching off everything that you get from the BBC for 9 days? Just going to stop you from being able to watch any television provided by the BBC, any programmes provided by the BBC, whatever platform you view them through, any radio that you listen to, any online services that you use, any catch-up television services that you use, all of it stopped for 9 days, because that's what your licence fee pays for. And we asked them, we talked to them at the beginning of the process, about how they felt about it, and a lot of them said they were perfectly happy, they didn't miss it, they wouldn't miss it. They didn't watch it anyway, they didn't listen to it, they didn't use catch-up, they didn't do this, they didn't do that, they didn't do the other, they didn't do any of it, and so they wouldn't be bothered. And then we went back to them afterwards and asked them how they'd found it, and we offered them the choice of having the BBC back or taking the £3.60 that they'd saved in the period of 9 days that they'd been without the BBC. And the transformation was quite extraordinary in the attitudes of most of the people. There were a couple who carried on saying that they'd prefer not to pay. Generally very poor households who were existing on state benefits and nothing else, and really do have no money. It's a simple fact. More money than people in the same situation in Argentina would have, but by the standards of Western Europe, not very little money. But the rest of the people that we tried the experiment with were very clear that actually they found that they took the BBC for granted because it was always there. They didn't realise that a lot of the programmes that they watched were actually from the BBC because they watched them on the Sky platform or another satellite or cable platform. They didn't realise that that was actually a BBC programme, and they wouldn't get it if the BBC didn't exist. And they had no idea how much of the BBC they consumed in any given week. And not only did some of them say they'd be very happy to pay the licence fee and they'd got it wrong, but a number of them were prepared to pay more than the licence fee because they said actually they valued it much more than they thought they valued it at the outset. So an interesting insight into audience attitudes, which I suspect would be the same if you did that experiment in a number of your public service media around the world. I suspect you'd find very similar things. Certainly in places like Canada and Australia, Denmark and those sorts of places, I suspect you'd find very, very similar outcome. Okay, just very quickly, I'll race through this because I think we've taken too much time talking and there's not enough time for you to ask your questions. Yes, indeed, I'm being reminded. There's somebody at the front waving placards at me, telling me that I've got no time. But as I said, BBC commercial services can take advertising and sponsorship, but there are guidelines in place to make sure that's done correctly. It has to be said that the UK and digital pan-regional advertising markets in decline, and pan-regional publishers typically struggle to access most national advertising markets. That's true the world over. And the digital advertising market is growing, but this is focused on social media and data-driven campaigns. So traditional news sites are losing out to digital natives, Vice, BuzzFeed, and so on and so forth. And general news content, and this is the very important point for all of us, general news content is relatively low value to online advertisers. Commands low, what we call cost per thousand. So with shifts to programmatic advertising, this automated advertising systems which are in place now in many jurisdictions in the world, that increases the pressure. And the other problem is that news consumption is shifting in everywhere to mobile and social, which tends to be much harder for publishers to monetize. So there are trends going on in the consumption of media which make maximizing advertising revenues more difficult. So all of our commercial services have to abide by the BBC's advertising and sponsorship guidelines. I'm going to go through what they say very quickly. So if you want to consult them, they're available on the website that I have, which is www.bbc.co.uk/ all in lowercase editorial guidelines. That's the website. It's accessible anywhere in the world in which you can find BBC's editorial guidelines and all the other guidelines that we produce for BBC. I'm almost, I've got to have to go very fast now. So we have those guidelines that apply to all of our advertising, and obviously people have to comply with local regulation and law as well. So they help to protect our global reputation, making sure that the advertising and sponsorship relationships are appropriate. That's what they look like. So all advertising must be legal, mustn't be misleading, harmful or offensive, must not jeopardise the good reputation of the BBC, must be clearly presented as commercial content. The nature of the advertising relationship must be transparent. We must retain editorial control. Advertising arrangements mustn't include any endorsement by the BBC and should avoid creating the impression of endorsement. The following categories of advertising are prohibited. I can give you this if you need it afterwards, Cynthia. Advertising by faith, religion or equivalent systems of belief, adult products or services, tobacco products, weapons and gun clubs. None of those are allowed. Nope, I hope not. Advertising in the following categories is approved by senior editorial figures. So political advertising where it's allowed, it's not allowed everywhere. Advertising by governments and government agencies, except tourism boards and trade or investment boards. Advertising by lobby groups. Advertising for infant formula or baby milk, that reflects a particular issue around the world. Advertising for products or services which share names or trademarks. News and current affairs output can't be advertised or sponsored against at all. And there are extra protections and restrictions for children's content. There they are. Native advertising is a term which is often used online to describe advertisement features. There are specific guidelines around native advertising. It has to be informative, interesting, add value, appropriate quality, and not influence or be perceived to have an influence the editorial content. That's the critical one as far as I'm concerned. So it mustn't imply endorsement and so on and so forth again. and not feature any recognisable BBC content and remain distinct from the editorial content of the service or publication. And then we have partnered content, advertisement features, and sponsored content as well, all of which have to have the same rules applied. We have a structure which oversees all of this, and here's some examples of the different thoughts of advertising. I don't know whether you can see these, but this is BBC News content with a political ad. I think the only one we've had so far for Hillary Clinton. It says "I'm with her," but I thought it said "I'm with Uber" when I first looked at it, which I thought there must be something wrong about that. This is a piece of partnered content, native advertising on the BBC website, which, as you can see, clearly states that it's advertising. Up the top of the right. Up the top in the right. Top right. Top right. It says advertisement. Top right. Then ads on some of our feature pages on the right hand side there. So I mean the critical thing here is that the advertisement can be seen as being separate from the content, and that's the critical issue for us, and that the advertisement and the content is not on the same subject. So for example, we wouldn't have a car ad on a piece about cars, so on and so forth. We wouldn't have any connection between the editorial and the ad. There's to be nothing there. Something about Quebec for our Canadian cousins. Again, an advertisement feature. And then this is in our magazines. I won't go into them. And our World Service channels can now carry some advertising, but they have to abide by the same guidelines. So that's BBC Vietnam, which is a World Service radio and online. The advert is the bit with Helen Mirren in. She's not knowingly Vietnamese. And Afrique, China. Thank you. Gracias.